Today we are going to connect the Port Freeway to the industrial road network with kind of a weird interchange. And then we're going to start filling in the interior of the peninsula with some interesting eclectic industrial lots. I think the freeway bridge and the rail bridge here are going to get their own episode in the future, but I did want to start off by getting the correct slope on the freeway bridge so that the interchange can interact with it in a more realistic way. So I'm going to raise up the central span so that this ship, as a stand-in here, can pass underneath with minor damage, but for the most part staying intact. And then I'm going to use Move It to get a nice gentle slope in between the top of the bridge and where the freeway leaves the embankment. The analogous interchange in Duluth is kind of interesting because it almost functions like an extended roundabout with a turnaround on either end. And I did try making something sort of similar, but I just really couldn't get it to look how I wanted. The biggest problem I had was that the ramp for traffic headed onto the bridge just ended up being way too steep. So what I decided to do was split the interchange into two sections to get more flexibility with how we can configure the ramps. So on this side, there's just a simple half diamond interchange, which looks a little bit weird as it is, but I think once we get to the detailing section, it'll make it look a little bit more realistic. It'll make a bit more sense. The main avenue also slopes up slightly here so that the ramps can pass over the rail yard at the right height, and that'll also reduce the vertical distance that the ramp heading onto the bridge has to cover. The avenue then curves over alongside the freeway here, which is going to allow for a nice smooth angle for the other half of the interchange, which we're going to get to in a second. But first I wanted to take the avenue all the way over here so that it can head directly to what will eventually become the public terminal. This stretch of road probably looks a little out of place at the moment compared to all the perfectly perpendicular roads that we have, but my thinking here is that it's a newer addition to the port that was built at the same time as the modernization of the public terminal. So they were willing to take this kind of unusual route to give more direct access to the terminal. Anyway, the other half of the intersection solves the slope issue by using a cloverleaf type ramp, which means that it intersects with the freeway at a much lower elevation, which makes the slope look more reasonable. And then we can just snake in the complementary off-ramp around it, with the final result being that it kind of looks like the top half of a trumpet interchange. In order to blend in the surroundings and make it look like this whole avenue interchange area appears to be up on an embankment, I'm going to fill in this area with some ploppable grass and add a little tunnel entrance over here. I don't know if that's really too realistic, since it seems like it might be easier to just have the track down in a kind of trench or something like that, but I do like how it looks, so I'm going to keep it, at least for now. Then for the sloped section of the avenue, I'm going to leave a grassy embankment on one side and then add in some basic retaining walls on the other side next to the rail yard, since we have this sharp vertical shift here. Due to the interchange networks, there are some portals to hell down here. So I'm going to patch those shut by extending out the service roads and adding in some ploppable gravel. Because I wanted to add slip lanes to this intersection without adding any more networks, because it's kind of annoying to make slip lanes like that, the IMT work for this spot is going to be kind of annoying because I basically have to create sort of a fake section that extends out into the node. And that's going to involve a lot of invisible intersecting lines, which is always kind of tedious to do in order to get everything in the right place. But eventually I figured it out, and I think the result looks okay, if not exactly perfect. IMT stuff for the freeway is a bit more straightforward because I already have presets saved for this kind of freeway detailing. Although I do have to do a bit of it from scratch because some of the nodes already have IMT rules in place for the props that are standing in for the median. Other than that, it's just a little bit of custom signage for the off-ramps, a couple other signs as well, and a little bit more IMT, and then a retaining wall for where the freeway heads off of the embankment. And I'm hoping that all those details are going to kind of bring this place together and make the whole thing look a bit more cohesive. Apparently there is a plan in place to renovate the equivalent freeway bridge in Duluth, which seems to involve a pedestrian deck running alongside the freeway lanes, so I thought it would be cool to add something similar in here. I'm going to use Network Multitool to attach the path network, and then Network Skins to remove the built-in pillars, because obviously it doesn't make sense for this thing to have its own pillars. Instead, I'm going to use IMT to give the appearance of structural integrity with these supports underneath, although they are just for show, so maybe don't mention that to anyone who is actually using the bridge. I'm going to add some lighting as well, and then paste everything across the whole length of the network. And finally, in order to keep it dry, I'm going to add in the roof option that's built into this network with adaptive networks. Even though there are some crosswalks at both of the intersections with the two halves of the interchange, this seemed like the perfect spot to have a pedestrian overpass across the street, since we already have the path running at just about the right height. So that way you can access the pedestrian bridge from either side of the road without having to jaywalk or wait for a traffic light. Personally, I always like going up these long sloping pedestrian paths in real life for some reason, so I'm just glad that I got to fit one in here. While I was working in this area, I also wanted to clean up the avenue intersections and the surroundings as well. So we have the intersection created by the slip lane that leads into the cloverleaf type ramp, which I'm going to just cover up with an IMT setting that I made in a previous episode. One problem here is the difference in texture between the freeway asset and the avenue asset, and instead of trying to match them up, I'm instead going to emphasize the difference by adding in a chevron filler and a painted line right along the seam, in the hope that it makes it look more like an intentional difference in materials. Of course, we're going to be keeping the other intersection instead of covering it up, but I do need to add in some grass fillers here, again to just make it look like this whole thing is on a big grassy embankment. Then I'm going to use some pavement props as well, since we have these gaps in the sidewalk, and I'm going to just jog that over to the crosswalk and then back over along the avenue. To finish off the embankment on this end of the interchange, I'm going to elevate this entire final stretch of the avenue so that it can leave the embankment and fly right on over the tracks and over to the terminal. I don't know exactly what we're going to build in this area where the rail is, but whatever it is, the avenue is just going to go right on over it. Finally, this end is going to get a similar treatment to what we did on the other end, with some retaining walls, grass props, and a tunnel entrance, which I'm just going to paste from the other side. And then I'm going to go ahead and smooth out the terrain so that we get a nice gentle slope. There is one more piece of infrastructure I did want to detail before moving on to the industrial build, which is the freeway overpass over this stretch of track that runs out onto this bit of land that is cut off by the freeway. By the way, I have absolutely no idea what I'm going to build in that area, so do please let me know if you have any interesting suggestions for that. But for today, we're just going to detail up the overpass. I'm going to add in some sloped concrete abutment thingies, which seem to be the support of choice for highway engineers. And since we're building this overpass anyway, I'm also going to take this service road and run it over along the edge of the rail yard and underneath the overpass so that vehicles can access whatever infrastructure or industry that we're going to build over here in the future. It does look a little unrealistic though, I think, to have these dirt networks surrounded by neatly trimmed grass, especially under the shadow of the bridge surface. So to fix that, I'm going to try to just messy it up a little bit with some ploppable gravel props and decals, which hopefully will blend the surfaces together a little bit more realistically. I'm not going to change these segments into the elevated versions because I don't think that the elevated versions of networks look particularly good for short sections of overpass like this. Instead, I'm going to keep the ground versions and then use IMT to cover up the gravel shoulders by adding some solid fences along the sides and then pavement networks on top. Then I just need to adjust the offsets for each rule so that they actually line up with the real span of the overpass. The result is not perfect, but I think it's good enough to look realistic in the background. Finally, we have some grass for the grass embankment and some happy little trees as well. Before getting into the industrial lots in this spot here, I wanted to give everything a bit of context by laying down the historical road network to get a better sense of how the road network and the lots that it creates would have developed over time. Of course, most of this grid that I'm going to make probably won't be around by the time we're done with the entirety of the port and the industrial area, since many roads would have been removed, shifted around, or had whatever changes made that the developments required, but I did want to have it available just as a point of reference, especially for some of the smaller lots that we're going to build. I think it'll maybe help with realism too to have some remnants of the original road network left once everything's said and done in this area. I'm thinking that this area is going to be one of the more modern developments in the port since it's on the site of a former rail yard that wouldn't have been demolished too far back. So they're not going to be sparkling new like the solar panel factory next door, but they are going to be consistently on the modern side and the truck-focused side. Whereas eventually I do want to include some historic buildings remaining in the other areas of the port. I'm just going to do some preliminary arrangement of buildings here to get a sense of how many lots we're going to fit in here and what kind of buildings we're going to put down. I looked at Duluth and some other industrial areas in the Midwest as well for inspiration, although we're going to start off with a fairly generic, modern-ish factory. Or maybe it's just a warehouse or something like that. Either way, I wanted this to be the most modern of the lots that we're going to build today, so it hopefully will help to transition from the bigger, more modern factory next door, the one we built last episode, to the kind of dinky little ones that we're going to build next. There's not too much exterior detail with this one because all the functional stuff is going to be going on inside the building. So I'm paying most of the attention here to the surrounding surfaces and the parking lot. as I was building this, I did decide to turn it into a factory of some kind as opposed to a warehouse. So I'm going to disable the asset's built-in warehouse functionality and then clip in an industry block into one of the garages so we can have some trucks coming and going, as well as an office block around front to represent the more administrative jobs. Before moving on, I realized that this lot looked a little bit too generic and rectangular, so I did add a little extra lot over to the side. I have no idea how they get these containers in and out of here, but that's not my problem anymore. I didn't want this whole industrial area to just be a bunch of factories, so for the next lot, I took inspiration from something that caught my eye while I was looking around Chicago on Google Maps, which is a lot full to the brim with garbage trucks. So this is where the city's garbage trucks are going to park and to have maintenance done and that sort of thing, which I think is kind of an interesting little addition to the waste infrastructure that I usually wouldn't think about. Usually I just build like a landfill or something and be done with it. So I kind of like the idea of having the different arms of our utilities spread out across the city in a way that's not necessarily the most efficient, but it does kind of speak more to the history of how these things have developed over time as demand has changed. Anyway, I wanted to vary the surfaces and shapes of the lot as we move through the different builds. So whereas the previous one was basically just a medium gray rectangle, this one is going to be lighter concrete in a more irregular shape. I also wanted to have plenty of open pavement here so that we can have tons and tons of garbage trucks parked and still leave room for navigation, of course. So instead of solely using networks to cover the whole area, I'm going to create a grass border around the perimeter of the lot using IMT, and then just fill in all the empty space with Surface Painter. So hopefully that'll save us a bit on our node count limit. I did mention this last episode, but weirdly one of the biggest challenges of this whole area was transitioning from the lot surfaces to the rail yard surface in a way that makes sense. So with the previous lot, I decided to make it look like there was a more recently cleared area and not much vegetation has had time to regrow. I didn't want to carry that theme all the way down the rail yard though, for some reason, so I decided to switch it up here by imagining that there used to be a small patch of vegetation between the current rail yard and the demolished one that all these buildings have been built on top of. So you end up having this single tree that they've kept intact that was in that area, plus some grass and shrubbery surrounding it. I thought that it might better represent the shifting demands of the city to have a few shops scattered in this more modern part of the industrial area. So in the case of this lot, we have what's essentially an industrial strip mall, which unfortunately is not as fun as it sounds because it's basically just factories that happen to have a public storefront. The details ended up being pretty similar to the first lot, with a parking lot, a few decals to roughen up the asphalt, and then the transition area between the lot and the rail yard, which in this instance, I'm kind of splitting the difference between the last two lots, using a mix of dirt and the sparse grass and shrubbery. But since this is meant to house businesses serving the public, I came back to spruce up the storefronts a little bit with some depressingly drab planters, a few young trees and bushes out front, and the few signs I had in my collection that seemed like they might fit into this kind of situation. This next lot ended up being my favorite out of all of them. I wanted to build something that looks like it's made up of several properties that have been tacked on over the years, so I'm going to try to give each building or set of buildings a unique surface around it to represent the different stages of development in a easily visualizable way. In the back near the rail yard, we have a more recently paved asphalt surface surrounding these warehouse buildings, and then out front, 2 older properties surrounded by concrete slabs. In order to further distinguish the properties, I'm going to fence them off from each other and then add some details to try to make them look like they each have a unique purpose. The one in back I wanted to make look like a plumbing company for some reason, so I'm going to give them a fleet of branded vehicles parked at various spots around the property, and then put down some miscellaneous industrial-ish details, including about a mile of pipe, because I don't really know what kind of stuff you'd find lying around outside at a plumbing business, but I figured pipe would be a strong contender. These 2 buildings out front have a shared parking lot in the middle that I mostly just added here to fill in some of the empty space. The bigger building on the right is just kind of a generic factory without too much detail on the exterior. Most of the stuff is going to be going on inside. But the smaller one on the left here does have an interesting silhouette of sorts, so I wanted to make it stand out a little bit more. It has a small yard out back, so I'm going to furnish that with some piles of random stuff. So I guess it sort of ends up looking like a really tiny scrapyard or something like that. So even though I don't really know how accurate these lots are compared to the sorts of things you see in real life, I still think it has an overall nice, kind of rough around the edges look that is going to add some funkiness to the industrial area, especially when you see it from above and you can see the differences in the surfaces and that kind of stuff. To finish off the episode, I wanted to take inspiration from something at the analogous location in Duluth that I've always found kind of weirdly fascinating, which is this massive Goodwill that looks like it's housed in an old warehouse or something like that. This classic distribution center building by Avanya happens to look pretty similar to the real life one, with the big difference being that it doesn't have a storefront for obvious reasons. So I'm going to spend way too much time making one of my own. First, I'm going to clip this British industrial building to serve as the main part of the facade, and then on the Duluth building, there's this sort of hood around the main entrance, which I think looks kind of interesting from a brutalist point of view, I guess. So I'm going to replicate that by making some copies of the big distribution center building and squishing them down until they're about wall width. Of course, no Goodwill is going to be complete without an overly large parking lot, so I'm going to build that very quickly, this time using the dark version of the big parking lot roads to try to keep up that alternation between different types of surfaces in between the different lots. And then I'm going to finish off the entrance itself with a donation bin, which I'm representing with this vanilla recycling container, colored blue, which honestly fits just about perfectly for this kind of thing. For functionality, it's pretty straightforward, just a commercial block to draw some customers and workers, and then a warehouse block around back to represent the many piles of old stuff that's barely nice enough to not go to the landfill that people drop off here and never ends up getting sold. Ever. And that's it. Thank you for watching, and a special thank you to my very first $5 tier member, Peter J. I hope that you guys enjoyed the slightly longer video than usual. Probably should have been 2 episodes, but oh well.